It is a great honor and a privilege to introduce John Fransman. We're here in your beautiful apartment in Jerusalem. And John, you were born in Holland.
In Amsterdam, in South Amsterdam, which was a fairly new neighborhood with many Jewish families living there.
What year were you born?
I was born August 39, about 3 weeks before the outbreak of the war. My grandmother, who had, my mother's mother that is, who'd emigrated from Holland around 1900 when her fiancé brought her and her mother out to London. My grandfather. They were all Dutch. They moved to the Mile End in the East End of London around 1900, and they had 5 children. The 2 eldest were my aunt and my mother. She then had twins, a boy and a girl, and some years later another son. There was 5 of them. Living in London, my grandmother was a dressmaker. Her husband from Holland was a cigar maker, but in fact in the East End he used to sell Singer sewing machines as a representative of the Singer company to the all the tailors that were moving into the East End of London. So that's a bit of family background, but it means that there was a lot of also relatives living still in London, a lot of cousins and so on. And in the 1930s they used to be able to travel to Holland and meet with family. As a consequence of that, my mother's older sister, Sissy Rabbi, married her first cousin in about 1930 or thereabouts, and they had 2 children, Morris and Helen. This is a picture of the 2 children they had. Morris was born in 1932, his sister Helen in 1934. She was a couple of years younger. And this is a picture of Morris and Helen with their grandmother, my mother's mother, and her youngest son holding the 2 children, the 2 babies, when they visited England, I guess, probably in 1935. Similarly, a little later, my mother also went to Holland, married one of her best friends of her cousin. My aunt's husband used to play bridge with 3 other guys, and so my mother ended up marrying one of them, Samuel Fransman. And this is Samuel with my mother, Annie Rabbi Fransman, when they were first married, I think in 1938, or maybe this is before they were married, visiting my younger aunt, my mother's younger sister, in London, in the East End, in Mile End. And that also shows my cousin Morris, the one that I just mentioned, was born in 1932, who was also visiting London at that time. I arrived, as I said, a little later, in August 1939, in south of Amsterdam, and this is a photo of my father holding me very proudly outside our apartment in South Amsterdam in the Oud-Hoornstraat. So there I was, maybe a few weeks old or thereabouts.
Were you born in the hospital?
I don't know. What I do know is that my grandmother, my mother's mother, came over from England for my mother's confinement. She was there at the birth, so it was probably a home birth. And at the time, you know, war was threatening, clearly, August 39. She said, come back with us, come back to England, you'll be safer there. My father refused. He said Holland, you know, was neutral in the first, in 1914 war, the First World War. It will be neutral again and we'll be safe. And he didn't want to leave his brothers, sisters, or his mother. So my grandmother went back to England and we stayed in Holland. And I have here photos. This is in my back garden in Amsterdam with my aunt holding me, the new baby, and her children, Morris and Helen, in the snow of the winter of 1939, 1940, probably January. This is me as a little fat little baby playing or being photographed with other friends in the street that I would play with, I guess, or I would be befriended by. This is me being held by my aunt Sissy and my mother Annie there. This is in the back garden of our apartment. This is a little portrait of me. And one more of my aunt, my mother's older sister, and my mother holding me.
It's amazing that these photos survived.
Well, yes. The reason these photos survived is because I guess as things were becoming more obvious in terms of Jews being taken away, our parents decided to give things to our friends to look after. So they gave photographs, and as a result I've got all these albums here that belong to my aunts that never returned.
And were these given to non-Jewish friends?
They were given to non-Jewish friends who returned to us after the war, when we returned. Yep. My cousins, Morris and Helen here, with their neighbour's friend, Yopi. These were Yopi's parents were neighbours to my aunt, and that's where they looked after a lot of the things that we received back after the war, like these photographs. So this is like in the back of the apartments that they used to live in South Amsterdam. I've got virtually no memories of before the war, other than vaguely seeing German soldiers in marching along one of the main streets near where we lived, and me together with other little children sort of finding it very exciting, hearing these soldiers marching into the city. I obviously didn't have a clue what was.
Is this one of your very first? One of your first recollections?
It was one of my first recollections. Yes. I also have a vague recollection of my father taking me to the bottom of the garden with my money box, my savings, and I guess with some other valuables that he buried at the bottom of the garden. And where we lived.
And how old were you at that time?
Well, I would have been, I suppose, 3, 4 years old, 3.5, 4, probably. So, the things that were happening to Jewish people, the imposition of wearing a red star, a Jewish star on outer garments.
The yellow star.
Yellow star saying Yot. Having to live under curfew and not being allowed to go to theatre and parks or cinema. All those restrictions, shopping limited to a couple of hours a day. Were obviously beginning to affect my parents. I was oblivious of it. They used to write to my aunt and my grandmother in London, and this is a photo of my uncle, my aunt's, the husband Isaac, and my father Samuel, writing a letter to their mother-in-law in London, and that's one of my father's sisters, older sisters, in the background. There were 3 unmarried sisters that lived with my grandmother in another part of Amsterdam, and this is one of them. My grandmother was widowed in 1926, my father's mother, that is. She was widowed in 1926. Also, I think there was a shortage of men, and so there were a lot of spinsters around in Amsterdam. So, as I say, 3 of the aunts lived with my grandmother. The first one of these, Sophie, who was born in 1902, she was transported, I believe in 1942, she was transported to Auschwitz and murdered there in about April, May 42, one of the earlier ones. The one I showed you there was Tante Lena, the one that was in the photograph there, I think, was my Aunt Lena. She and her sister and my grandmother were transported in 1943, and they ended up in Sobibor. The letters that were being written there, I have copies of them.
And in Sobibor, were they killed? In Sobibor?
In Sobibor they were killed, yes. Many Dutch Jews ended up in Sobibor, either Auschwitz or Sobibor. The majority of Dutch Jews went to Sobibor, and they were murdered there on arrival, virtually. Yeah, they weren't in work camps from that place. So this is a slightly larger photograph of the same. Sorry, I have the... And this is these are copies of the letters that my cousin Morris managed to have or keep, and that came back from the war. These are photocopies because the originals are in the United States Holocaust Museum, not on show but in their vast warehouses.
The family donated to the Holocaust Museum?
He donated it all there, yeah. My cousin Morris did. It's written in Dutch. It shows on one side the letter going from my aunt Sissy to her mother in Finchley. They'd moved from the East End to where my uncle Sam had a property in East Finchley in Devon Rise, and so he moved because of the bombing in the East End, he moved his mother and his sister and family, sister, husband, aunt, and some children, a couple of children, all into this house in Devon Rise. You can see with the stamps that the letters were limited to 25 words. They went via the Red Cross, which you see a stamp, but you also see another stamp here, which meant that it had gone past the German censor.
Yeah, I think, wow,
This stamp there, which was meant to, what they could write was very limited and wasn't relevant to what was going on politically. That's the stamp there on that side. And this would be the response from my, this one is in June 43, and it was written by, signed by my other aunt, the younger sister that stayed in London, that lived in London and was married in London. This is an earlier version. This is a letter going backwards and forwards. It's on very flimsy paper, so a lot of the ink has gone through, bled through to the other side. But this basically was the same sort of idea as from Isaac Raby, sent to my grandmother Rebecca Raby. This was in, the date of this one was a little bit earlier. Can't see it clearly here, but it would have been about May or March. No, wait a minute, it was February. This one went in February. There's backwards and forward. This one that was in June was returned by my aunt because my grandmother, in trying to find any news about her children, her 5 children, or the 4 of them that were involved in two abroad, 2 daughters in England. She was so involved in trying to get news, and she was crossing the road in Littleton Road in the East End, in East Finchley. She got knocked down by a lorry and died from a head injury in 1944 at that time. So her daughter responded to the letter there in June without telling them that their mother had died. The 4 children, the two boys, one was in the British Navy, and the younger son was in the British Army out in Singapore, and he became a victim of the Japanese. He was in Changi jail, and then later on in building the railway over the bridge of the River Kwai, working in that sort of environment. But he did survive, as did my uncle in the British Navy, and they came back eventually. We were arrested in June 1943, sorry, and there was a knock on the door, what we called the Groene Politie, the Green Police, and a German soldier. They were armed. They gave us about an hour's warning to get some things together. Because we're going on transport.
The Green Police, that was Dutch. The Police, they were Dutch.
The Dutch police, yes, but they were totally controlled. The civil service was totally controlled by the German administration, by an Austrian called Seyss Inquart, who was in charge of the Dutch country. Holland was invaded in May 1940, and after a tremendous amount of bombing of the Rotterdam port and so on, the Dutch army gave in after about 6 days of war fighting. So from May 1940 onwards, this was life. But as I say, the removal of Jews from Holland sort of occurred from 1942 onwards, the early start of the final solution.
Do you remember walking in the streets or the fear of German soldiers or being caught?
Well, as I mentioned before, the initial seeing German soldiers marching in was an exciting experience for young kids.
Any other memories of?
Well, I didn't pick up on the fear that was sort of being transmitted to adults. I didn't pick up on that at all. Even going on transport, when we were arrested, we were taken out from our homes.
And you remember when they came to arrest?
Station.
You remember that
No.
incident?
No.
No. You were so small.
Yeah. Well, I was 1943, June 43. I was not quite 5 years old, and I don't know whether I've repressed my memories, but it's possible as a defence mechanism. So we were transported, taken to the train station, and from by train taken to Camp Westerbork. My aunt also, and a husband and 2 children, they were also taken to Westerbork. This was basically the route for most Jews to go via Westerbork camp, a camp that had been set up by the Dutch government in, I think, about 1938 to house German Jewish refugees from Germany, because there was a lack of housing for German Jews. They'd been coming in, obviously, since the rise of Hitler, and the Dutch Jewish population had increased from about 110,000 Jews in 1933 to about 140,000 by beginning of by 1939, when the start of the war, as a result of German Jews sort of being able to get into Holland, but not much further than that. Although there were efforts to help German Jews get visas and go to South America and places elsewhere. The reality was that there was a conference in Evian in 1938 where the great powers basically refused to take in Jews and said they already had too much and there was no room to take in Jews. I don't know if that was partly anti-Semitic or partly because of the Great Depression that had occurred. There was still a lot of unemployment and difficult economic situations in these various countries. History will determine reality. Anyway, so the population in Holland had swelled to about 140,000 by the beginning of the war. Of that, about 30,000 maybe survived by the end of the war, and of the Dutch Jewish population had been really decimated. Anyway, we were in Westerbork. The routine generally was that people arrived in that camp and were there for maybe a week or 2 weeks, and then their names were put on a transport list, and each Tuesday a train would depart from Westerbork and take about 2,000 people east. They were given the story that they would be looked after, they would be working to help the German war effort. They would be going east to work in factories and so on. So by this sort of deception, people went along believing the story and not revolting. against it. There was an occasion when a cousin of mine, whose story is in here, she was, my father was the youngest. Well, the story, she's written it herself, is all in Dutch, but I've got a translation here of it in English. She was born in 1915, Jannie, a cousin of mine, in other words, one of my father's older sister's daughters. My father was the youngest of 11 children. The oldest were born in about the 1890s. The oldest two brothers had emigrated to America, but the other 9 were still living in Holland. And she was the daughter of one of those living in Holland. She was transported via first Camp Vught in Holland, and then from Vught she went to Westerbork. She was married. She had a husband called Ben. They came in September to Westerbork, met my mother and father there, her uncle, but they went on transport within a week or so in September 1943. She ended up in Auschwitz with her husband, and he died presumably there or in a work camp. She was put in an experimental block, Jannie, as a result of which she says she was not able to have any children after the war. And but she survived that. She also had various other experiences working in, I think, Ravensbrück in a munitions factory and so on.
In Auschwitz, was she in with Mengele? Was he involved with the experiments?
Well, yes, that's right. She was in the experimental block, but apart from her being infertile, also they also took blood for the Germans from her. But otherwise, she was. I don't think she had a lot of experimentation on her. She wasn't a twin. My mother and father, and also my aunt and her husband and children, we were all transported. We were held in Westerbork for 7 months. And we were eventually put on a list in January 1944, and that list was for transporting us to Belsen. We didn't know why we had this special treatment, but we ended up in what was known as the Star Camp in Belsen.
This is Bergen-Belsen.
In Bergen-Belsen, where my father went with the men in men's barracks. My aunt, her children, my mother and I ended up in the women's barracks, a barrack in Bergen-Belsen. And my aunt and her 2 children were on the top bunk. These were these banks with three high levels. My mother and I were in the middle bunk below my aunt. And that's where we spent the next 14, 15 months until early April 1945, from January 44. We used to have to go on parade, stand very early in the mornings. They'd shout "Raus, Raus." We'd have to get up maybe 6 o'clock in the morning and come out to the parade ground and stand in rows of 5. I'd stand in front of my mother. I learned to be able to behave myself. This is now as a 5-year-old. I knew I was sort of very intimidated by these officers in their leather coats and whips and so on that used to go up and down the lines counting, and with their high caps made them very tall and commanding and very authoritative. It was quite scary to me, but anyway, we stood on parade for several hours while they counted and recounted us until eventually they were happy with the numbers. I suppose my memories were probably of a later period when people had started from starvation, from the rations that we had started dying.
And also the illness.
And so they had to count the numbers that were left in the barracks that hadn't moved out. So that what they did was they got people to bring out the dead, and they'd be lying outside the barracks. They'd be dumped there. Early on when this happened, when people died, there was a small crematorium in Bergen-Belsen, and that's where they would dispose of the early corpses. Later on that became an impossible task because of the number of people dying. But at the end of October 1944, my mother and I were called to the men's barracks, and what hit me there was the stench, a totally different smell. It stank. But we were called there because my father had died. He died of the men had been working in a sort of a shoe factory where they were ordered to take apart shoes that had been taken from people that they'd murdered in Auschwitz and so on. So they had to take apart the leather to reuse the usable parts of the leather shoe for rebuilding into new boots and shoes for the German army. That was the work they were engaged in. And the food I didn't describe, but our daily ration was a thin soup made out of potato peeling, swedes, turnips, all sorts of that type of vegetable. And it would be very watery, it wouldn't be very clean. You'd often have grit mixed in with the watery soup. People used to have to line up, and the women would bring out the milk churns of this soup from the kitchen, and people would either maybe fight to be at the head of the queue, maybe to get a little bit of solid potato or whatever in their soup, and other people would prefer to be at the back. There were often fights about this because maybe there'd be, a solid bit of food, soup or something in the bottom of the churn, milk churn, and they hoped to get that. And that was sort of the lunchtime, midday sort of meal. And in the evening we received a couple of slices of bread, and that was our rations, generally speaking. There were occasional Red Cross parcels that were allowed through, and that was an exciting time when people...
And do you remember being very hungry?
To get in that.
Do you remember
Do I remember being hungry? No, I don't. And I still don't suffer from hunger. Even now I can go without meals and not get any hunger pains at all. I think my body sort of adjusted to the reality. I was also a small kid, so I didn't need the same calories that an adult needed, and that was the problem with men who were working and needed maybe 3,000 calories, and the reality was that they ended up with less than 1,000 calories a day, much less. And that's why my father died. As I say, we were called to the men's barracks. I remember seeing my father lying on the bench. He was virtually a skeleton. My mother, the men at that, the men managed to write. They obviously had some paper, and they wrote a death certificate. It's in Dutch again, but it was signed by the chief rabbi of a town in northern England, northern Holland, Groningen, a rabbi by the name of S. Levinson, who was the chief rabbi of, which it says Oper Rabbein, and two witnesses as well, Mr. de Wilde. It was written by, it must have been somebody like a lawyer who knew what to write, showing when my father was, where he was born, what date he was born, that he died in Bergen-Belsen on 31st of October 1944. And it was like a declaration, and then it says the undersigned witnesses to this.
And how did you receive this? Did they give it to you?
They gave it to my mother, and she kept it. And
why do you think they asked you to come, your mother and you to come, to maybe identify?
Sorry?
Why did they ask you and your mother to come?
To witness that he died.
To witness that he died.
And then later on, they gave her on the middle of November, a couple of weeks later, so that she wouldn't be an aguna. She would have
That's amazing.
the evidence to show that she was widowed and could remarry in Jewish law.
Yeah. And John, seeing your father, that he had died, it must have been very traumatic for you.
It was, but after all that time in Belsen, it didn't provoke any tears or anything.
You had seen other dead bodies as well?
We were getting used to people dying.
Was it a lot of typhus? They say
not yet.
Not yet?
Not in October, no.
Was that much later?
That came later. Yeah. No, well, that certainly came a lot later. A little later in November, either I think it was December, my uncle and 180 men were called up, including my uncle. They were all men that had worked in the diamond industry, and they were all taken away, transported, we didn't know where, but my cousin, his son, later found out that they were taken to Auschwitz. They were brought there and possibly tortured because the Germans wanted to find out where the Dutch Jews had hidden stocks of diamonds in Amsterdam when they were, before they were taken. My cousin found out that his father had been brought back to Belsen around about at some time afterwards, but that he died in February 45 in Belsen. I believe of the 180 men, only about one survived. The women, their wives, were there also collected up, rounded up, and they were transported to another camp where my aunt Sissy was in a mine, I think a salt mine, where she worked on munitions. It might have been Ravensbrück, I'm not sure. Oh, she never remembered the name of the camp. And their children, there was about 50 odd children, they were rounded up, put on a lorry, driven around for a couple of hours, and then eventually they were ended up in a barrack somewhere, in a different section of Belsen, totally different section to where we were. But later on, my must have been sometime in maybe the end of December or January, my mother saw them in this other part of the camp, and it was sectioned off. There was a barbed wire fence from where we were, where we saw Morris and Helen. But at least they found out they still had an aunt there. They still had a connection, and vice versa. My aunt still was able to see her niece and nephew. And one day she had a couple of sugar cubes, and when we went to meet up with Morris and Helen, she threw the sugar cubes over the fence for them. And a capo saw this, and we weren't allowed to talk to people in other sections of the camp. He started to chase my mother. He shouted at her and chased her with this truncheon, was threatening her. I just shrunk away. Somebody beckoned to her to come into a barrack, which she did. She managed to get into one of the barracks and hid somehow. The person obviously helped her to hide somewhere. And so the capo gave up, and she survived. That was quite a traumatic experience, which has stayed with me ever since. There were times when we were, as little children, left alone basically, and we used to play in the mud between the barracks. And I can remember one game we played with a bunch of boys and girls. We dug a hole in the mud and where the water was seeping in, and then covered it up with grass and leaves and little sticks. And that was our way. We were hoping that a German officer would trip up and fall over. It was our way of fighting back against the Germans. Anyway, conditions became considerably worse as we go into the winter of 45, January, February. What was happening was the Allies were coming in, had landed back in June, and were making good progress. I can remember at that time, on 2 different occasions, dogfights, aeroplanes up in the sky, and stray bullets strafing the barracks. I hid under a table. My mother got me to hide under a table as sort of protection. I remember coming out afterwards, seeing the splintered wood of the bed, the 3 high bunks, and wood being splintered where a bullet had gone in to them. And this was very exciting. It gave people hope. It gave us all hope that the Allies were, the Germans were beginning to lose the war, and there was hope that we would be rescued and survive. What else? There also, at the same time, there were more people arriving. These were people that were prisoners that had been brought from work camps in the east on what were called death marches. And they were all being brought to Bergen-Belsen, so that numbers were increasing rapidly from January onwards in the camp of Belsen. It was created tremendous overcrowding, which was very difficult to deal with, and led eventually to the breakdown of no water supply, and even the kitchens were unable to provide enough food. They had to bring in food from the nearby villages of Bergen. but it was totally inadequate. And the bread, the flour, was a sort of mixture of sawdust and flour. It wasn't proper bread anymore. So one day there was a train, and from our camp, the Star Camp, about 2,000 people went on this train and left Belsen. And the following day there was another train load being collected, and my mother decided we should go on that train. So my mother and I left on this second train about the 6th of April 1945, leaving my cousins, Morris and Helen, in their section with the other children in where they were in the camp. We were on this train for about 5 or 6, 7 days, going backwards and forwards in the German countryside. We ended up in a place called Farsleben, or near Farsleben, which is near Magdeburg. That's the main city, about 100 miles east of Bergen-Belsen and 100 miles short of Berlin in that direction. On the 7th day or so, the German guards that were with us, I saw, were taking off their uniforms and putting on civilian clothes. I saw them burning papers in a dustbin, and they disappeared. They went into the countryside, into the forest. We were left by this train in a sort of a siding. My mother was very weak. She stayed on the train. I stayed with her. And the following day there was a couple of tanks that were scouting, American tanks, and they found this train of 2,500 survivors. Not all of them were survivors. A few people, quite a number of them, had died. Were lying in, most of them were in the cattle wagons, and you know, quite a few of them had died. But we were, my mother and I were in compartments with proper seats, also squashed in on that train. The Americans got a shock when they saw us. The two tanks, one of them went back to report and carried on with the war effort. They had to report to command. They were the scout tanks, and the other one stayed with the train and put some guards around it. And then the American army sort of came in and had to find somewhere to rehouse 2,500 prisoners, which they did. They found a place in another village called Hillersleben, where there was a German airfield with officers' quarters and barracks, proper housing, where you know the German army families were housed, and they cleared out the remaining officers and rehoused us in these flats. The first thing they did, I can remember, was to take our clothes off, wash us, hose us down, and then dust us with white powder, DDT powder, which we now know is carcinogenic, but at that time it was to delouse us. One of the things I didn't tell you earlier was that the routine that my mother had daily while we were in the camp was to use a very fine net comb in my hair to take away lice and the little white eggs that they laid, the nets which she'd have to break open between her fingernails. That was a regular routine to keep us clean and healthy. There were other people that didn't do that, and they ended up being diseased, being overcome by lice, eating away their bodies. that so conditions, the conditions were indescribable.
Can I ask, on the train, did you receive any food?
Sorry?
When you were on the train, did you receive any food?
No food for 5-6 days.
And when the Americans came,
The Americans came.
Did they give you?
They were giving people a bit of chocolate, cigarettes for those that wanted to smoke. Until they brought us to the barracks in Hillersleben, and then they could look after us properly. But they had to be very careful what they did give us to eat, because our stomachs were shrunk and incapable of dealing with normal food. It had to be sort of very watery porridge type stuff.
They say many people unfortunately died from the rich food that they immediately consumed.
In Hillersleben, from the train itself, I think there's a small cemetery there now with about 140 of the people that they found that had already died in the train during that time. And then again in Hillersleben, more people died there as well. By the time they set up a small hospital. My mother went into the hospital because she had typhus by then. A lot of people had typhus. Belsen itself was a highly infectious place because of all the people the filth and disease, the people that they brought in from what were called death marches, where they brought 10,000 people away from a factory somewhere in Germany or in Poland and marched them across the countryside, by which time 10% survived and 90% had died en route. These people were on their last legs and were dying at a great rate in Belsen. But they also brought disease and the lice and everything else that were affecting everyone. It meant I saw so many dead bodies. Death means very little emotionally to me, as against somebody who knows better. Who, as a young child, I thought this was normal. This was normal. This is how I grew up at that stage of my life, of what normality was. Anyway, I ended up in this little flat in Hillersleben. While my mother was hospitalised, I was looked after by other survivors on the train, Hungarian and Polish women. I learnt to speak a little bit of Hungarian at the time, which I've since forgotten. I found my first toys in a cupboard in the flat that I was occupying. There was a little wooden aeroplane, but the aeroplane had the swastika marks on it, or the cross, the German cross, and I was obviously very angry and I broke the aeroplane. I didn't like that. But I also found two nice little cars. One was a little wind-up car, a red one that you could run on the table, and when it got to the edge of the table it turned round. It didn't fall off. And the other one was a little blue car with a steering wheel which operated the front wheels, and it had a little gear lever as well and a brake.
Wow.
Amazing. The little gear lever had the 5 little spaces, the places where you put it up or cross and up and down, just like a real car. I think it was made by Schuko, and I brought that back to Holland after the war and kept it. It's now in a museum in the Holocaust Museum in Nottingham in England, on loan there. After a few weeks my mother recovered. She got better. The Red Cross had been brought in and got involved with recording people who had survived and also helping people return to their countries, to their towns and wherever they lived. what had happened when we were taken out of our homes in Amsterdam, the first thing that happened was there was a company called Pulsen that removed all the contents of Jewish homes. I believe took them back to Germany. And that's why there's so much in the way of art, paintings and so on, some of which were valuable. Many weren't, of course, but there had been the issue of museums that have ended up with stolen art from Jewish people.
It's still going on
Still
today.
going on today. That's right. But it was all taken, and our apartments, they were like municipal flats, apartments belonging to the South Amsterdam Council, where they'd rehouse people, other families into our place, so we couldn't go back to my home. I think the priority at the time during that early stage was to rehouse National Socialist supporters, Nazi supporters in the Dutch population. About 15% of Dutch people were supporting the fascist Nazi party, and they got the priority in these rehousing of Dutch Jewish families. So we had to move in with a neighbour. The Red Cross helped us to find a neighbour that was willing to take us in. That's what we did, I suppose, in about May, June 45. We moved in with a neighbour, but after about 3 weeks she found out she couldn't take my noisy, bad behaviour. I was probably a bit of a wild 5-year-old, getting on for 6 at that time.
Was it a Jewish neighbour?
I think she may have been Jewish, but I'm not 100% sure. Because if she was Jewish, she would have most likely been transported. I'm not sure. But there was another, she put up with this for about 3 weeks and then said we had to find somewhere else. With my mother then found a friend of hers, an English Jewish lady who was married to a Christian man. She had 3 children, 2 much older, an older boy and a girl, and a young boy who was younger than me, about 3 years old, Lucia. And she took us in, and she was much more understanding and kind to put up with me because of her own, having her own children around. So I have some photos of that. First of all, when we left the camp, when we left the American camp in Hillesleben, the camp council, the American soldiers, gave us a certificate of confirming that me, Johnny Fransman, born 14th August 39 in Amsterdam, was since the 12th of January 1944 until the 7th of April 45 in Bergen-Belsen, and that we were held there for possibly being exchanged for German prisoners of war. We were valuable material, and the reason for that was because my mother and her aunt had been born in London, and that's the reason we were taken to Belsen and not to Auschwitz or Sobibor.
And maybe we
didn't know that at the time.
Maybe that's why you stayed so long in Westerbroek as well.
That's when they knew that she was born in England, and that's why we were held in Westerbroek for 6-7 months before they decided that they wanted to keep people with Allied connections, maybe a visa or birth in England or America or somewhere like that, who might be valuable for trading with German prisoners.
They did it with the Templars, with the Templars. They actually did trade with the Templars.
Yes, they were traded. So that was the first train that I was mentioned there was a further train.
Can I just ask, how did your
us-
mother decide to go on the train? Did she have special permission to go on the train?
They were clearing out this special camp, the Star Camp, which had about 5,000 or so prisoners.
But it was her initiative to go onto the train.
She thought it was her initiative. I don't know whether it was or whether she would have had to have gone anyway. We could have gone on a third train where a friend of mine who also survived ended up. A third train left after us was found on about the 23rd of April, rather later, by Russian soldiers, and they were rescued by Russian soldiers on, as I say, 23rd of April. Meanwhile, my cousins were found by the British Army when they liberated Belsen on the 15th of April, 2 days after us. We were found by the Americans on the 13th of April in Farsleben. My cousins Maurice and Helen were found by the British 15th. The British Army, as you probably already know, they rehoused the prisoners that they found in the adjacent camp, which was a German army camp, army training camp, which had proper brick-built barracks where they could set up proper field hospital and rehouse the prisoners. What they had to do was they set all the wooden barracks that we had been in the Bergen-Belsen camp within the camp where all the prisoners had been. They burnt it down because the whole place was infectious. So my cousin Helen, she was taken into a hospital barracks, and she was looked after there by young medics that were brought in from England. But unfortunately she died about 10 days after liberation. I have a photo of her here that was taken by a British photographer, and it was published in one of the British newspapers after the war, saying she survived, but in fact she died about the 25th of April. And you can see from her arm that she was
like a skeleton.
Like a skeleton, that's right. As were so many of the people that were there, that they found. My cousin, after his sister died, he knew a little bit of English, and his mother had made him remember, remember the address of his uncle in London. And so the army flew him back to London, where he was able to go to his uncle's place. I don't know if his uncle was back yet, whether he was demobbed yet, but his aunt was living there, and he joined another cousin there. After the war, in 1947, I was able to go to school. I was very keen to go to school. I'm just sorry I've left out a little bit. My aunt, who'd been in the salt mine working on munitions, was rescued by Swedish Count Bernadette, I think, and taken back to Sweden.
Those were with the white ambulances.
Yeah, and they found a shadow of TB on her lung, so she was hospitalised for a couple of months, or thereabouts, 2 or 3 months, and she eventually came back about September 45 to Amsterdam after recovering, and she managed to organise, together with my mother, a new apartment in South Amsterdam, where we lived from September 45 until we went to England. what had happened, so as I say, I managed to go to school in 1947, September 47.
When did you go to England? What year did you leave to England?
In 1949.
I said you went to school first in Holland.
So I went first of all to school in Holland for about a year and a half. My uncles, who by then had been demobbed, suggested to their sisters that they should come back to England. Each one of them would sort of help look after, find them somewhere to live and help them sort of get themselves on their feet. They were both widowed, so they applied to the British consul, and because they'd married Dutchmen, they'd lost their British nationality. It took something like 8 months for the British consul to agree to allow my mother to become a naturalised British citizen again, even though she'd been born in London. So we were naturalised early 1949, and in March 1949 we went to England, where my uncle, the one who'd been in the Japanese prisoner of war camp, he'd bought with his army gratuity a house with people living downstairs. We had an upstairs apartment with a couple of bedrooms, and that's where we moved in with him. He was an unmarried bachelor, and after a while his lifestyle just didn't accord with having his sister and a young boy around. He found himself a job in Ireland. He was a ladies' hairdresser. He found a job in Ireland managing a hairdressing shop in Dublin. For the owner lived in north of Liverpool, in Poulton-le-Fylde, north of Liverpool. And they got on very well for many years. So my mother and I lived in North London. My aunt, also her brother, the one that had come back from the Navy, helped her find an apartment through a distant relative who owned some apartments, and she was in North Finchley. She lived in North Finchley for a while. And
John, can I just ask you, with regard to the school in Holland, when you went to school,
yes,
how did you get on with other children? Was it difficult to make friends or to?
No. I had good friends.
And the majority, were they not Jewish or?
They were all
or Jewish?
All but one that I know of was non-Jewish. They were all non-Jewish children.
But they accepted you?
They accepted me. I was just another child. They didn't know I was Jewish.
And they didn't know your history?
One of the things my mother decided after the war was that nobody should know I was Jewish, or that she was Jewish, except where she had to go to work when she was in London. Even in Holland, after the war, she had to work. My grandmother, her mother had been a dressmaker, and her husband had died in the 1919 flu, my mother's father, in the 1990 flu epidemic. He died, so she was widowed from that age with 5 young children, the oldest of which was about 14. She had to leave school, and they had to go out to work. My Aunt Sissy and my mother went out to work. They learnt to make ladies' hats, sewing ladies' hats. They were very adept. My aunt was quite talented. She became a hat designer as well. So they had a hard time before the war, and I think it was maybe one of the reasons they ended up marrying in Holland. It was one way of escaping that sort of life. having to help support their mother. The boys, as they grew older, also had to do the same work, and they were both ladies' hairdressers. So, as I say, the younger one ended up in Dublin. My other uncle had a hairdressing shop in Fransman, also in North London somewhere. My aunt ended up marrying the man who had rented the flat to her. He was a widower, and they ended up living in Brighton. But
was he Jewish?
He was a fairly frum Jew from the East End. He had a shop with men's clothing. He sold the materials for tailors to make suits. He had a shop in Brick Lane, right opposite the Machzika Hadass synagogue, where Rabbi Cook was rabbi for a while before he became chief rabbi in Israel when he moved to Haifa. He insisted I should have a bar mitzvah when I was 13, and so I went to the nearest synagogue for about 6 months, Highgate Synagogue, because we were living in the Holloway area of North London. I went for about 6 months, learnt to read, learnt my portion, attended synagogue on the morning of my bar mitzvah, and did my portion very nicely. Apparently I sang nicely, and that was total connection to synagogue for many years.
You didn't go to Jewish school?
I didn't go to a Jewish school. I was in a non-Jewish neighbourhood. I went to school with, as far as I knew, in a working class neighbourhood of North London, very non-Jewish sort of neighbourhood.
And did any of your friends know that you were Jewish?
Nobody knew I was Jewish. My mother didn't want anyone to know. That was the lesson she learned from admitting, or that being in Holland and knowing people knew that we were Jewish. She felt led to us being taken away, being collected and rounded up and taken to the camp. So the lesson she learned from that was not to let anyone know. And so I grew up. It wasn't until I was in 16 that my cousin sort of invited me to go to his Jewish club at Muswell Hill Synagogue, and so I went.
And in all those years, Yom Kippur or Rosh Hashanah or Pesach, you never...
Didn't mean anything to me. Didn't know what it was about. Didn't attend. Carried on going to school. Had no connection at all with Judaism at that time. Anyway, I did, when I was in sixth form, meet a Jewish friend, made a Jewish friend, and he was a Zionist, so I ended up going with him to a Zionist club. It was a draw, sort of, I think it's affiliated to Habonim now.
Yeah.
And I went on a holiday when I was 18 to the south of France to this Jewish Zionist holiday camp, which was fun. I was encouraged to buy some cigarettes on the boat going across the channel, so that I could offer them to other people. I didn't smoke at that time, but I was encouraged to smoke, and that was the beginning. I started smoking then as a result of that holiday. But basically, these movements were trying to indoctrinate me into politics, into very left-wing politics, and that didn't suit me. So I didn't stay a member of that for too long. And then I went off at the age of 18 to university in Southampton to study mathematics. Took a degree in mathematics. I didn't join the Jewish Society there either.
And they had a society. They did have a society.
They did have a Jewish society at the university, but I refrained from joining it. I still remained a supposedly Church of England sort of member. I mean, that in junior school, that was when you had assembly in the morning. I joined in. I used to recite the what they call the Lord's Prayer. Yeah.
It's amazing that your mother agreed for you to have the bar mitzvah.
Yes.
And your mother was there when you had the bar mitzvah?
She was, well, we had a little party at home for a close family. Yeah. But yeah, things were very tough. She had to go out to work, and it wasn't until I went off to university that I allowed her. She'd met somebody. She'd met one or two men before, but I was very critical of them. And eventually I agreed she remarried. And she moved also to where her sister lived in Brighton.
And did she marry somebody Jewish?
She married somebody Jewish, somebody somewhat older, somebody from a Polish background, who'd left home, his Polish home at the age of 9 to avoid being conscripted in the Russian army. He ended up in Germany. He became a tailor, very accomplished. He was married and had a son. But at the rise of Hitler in the 30s, he got out. He left his wife and son behind. He ended up in Australia, working for a big department store, Jones, in Sydney. His wife and son, I think, ended up in Argentina.
Oh, they survived?
Yeah, I guess they left. He didn't call for them when he ended up in either England or Australia, en route to Australia. He left them behind, and they must have made their way to Argentina before the war, which is where they ended up. So that was my mother's life. That at least at that stage she could stop working.
Did he ever reconnect with his wife and son?
No, never.
Did he get a divorce from her, or?
I don't know what the legal situation was, to be honest.
It's amazing.
But they were married, so I think they must have. Probably his wife had sued for a divorce, which he granted, I imagine.
And did they have any children together?
My mother and he? No, they were beyond that age, I think. Yeah, there was no further children.
And he treated you well?
I'd left home. I was in university, and
your mother was happy?
I was working.
Your mother was happy being remarried?
When
was your mother? She was happy that she had remarried?
Recently, yes. Yeah, it was better than. She was married to a Jewish man. She by then had a pension a Dutch pension from Holland. That, although the Dutch got reparations from the Germans to help survivors, they started paying a pension to Dutch survivors living in Holland around in the 50s, I believe. She had to work for a pension until mid-60s, before as a Dutch survivor living outside of Holland, she got a pension from Holland. Not until mid-60s, about 1964, 65. I applied for a pension. No, yeah, I applied for a pension, and I was in correspondence for several years. Eventually, they recognised that I was a survivor. And
Took them a long time.
And in 1976, by which time I was running my own business, my income was such that it was beyond receiving any sort of pension from them, which was it was based on income rather than on just being a survivor. So that was a result of dealing with the Dutch government.
And can I ask, before
In fact, I did apply for something called non-measurable health costs, non-measurable health injury as a result of the war. So that's a minimal amount that they pay, other than a proper sort of pension, survivor pension. And I received that from the Dutch government.
Can I ask, before the war, was your family a traditional Jewish family?
Traditional
Religious?
Dutch Jewish family. The Dutch Jews were they were very much marrying amongst Dutch, not marrying out.
Mm-hmm.
I know my mother used to go to her mother-in-law, and all the family would get together on a Friday night, and it would be more of a social, but it wasn't a very religious
But traditional,
life.
very traditional.
Very traditional.
And
Jewish
later on in the
society.
years, when your mother remarried, did you become more traditional again?
Not
or?
really. No, it wasn't. It wasn't very much an input in her life. More so my aunt, because of her husband was much more traditional and would go to shul regularly. Take me when I was visiting. He'd take me to synagogue in Hove. He insisted. He bought me my tefillin and my first prayer book and my bar mitzvah, and talus for my bar mitzvah. And he's the one that had the influence and did occasionally when I was in Brighton take me to synagogue. I didn't have much of an idea what was going on. I didn't read, I could read Hebrew, but I didn't know what prayers they were reciting at a great speed anyway. Passing I could read. My Judaism came to me. Let me first go back a little bit. In Holland I went to school, and I enjoyed school very much. I was a good learner. This was taken on what's called Santa Claus Day, my class with the teacher.
And where are you in the picture? Where are you in the picture?
I'm a little boy sitting down here at the front row there with my two girlfriends on either side. Yeah. But at the back there's St. Nicholas with Black Peter, somebody blacked up, as his servant, who used to give out all the presents. Little kids believed in all that. This is some years later when I graduated with a master's degree at Southampton with my mother and my aunt, the two survivors.
That's wonderful.
Right. Now, in here I have a multiple number of photos. This is the school in Holland. When the weather was nice, we sat outside, and this is me in my classroom.
If I can just...
yes.
This is lovely. Oh.
That's me in the classroom.
And you were happy? You were happy going to school?
I was very happy going to school, in Holland. Here we are, St. Nicholas. Where am I on this one? A little bit hidden away behind there. That's a 7-year-old there. This was me after the war, here. And here, this is where we lived. This has all been built up now since.
And are the apartments still there?
This is in the neighbour's flat, the people that gave back these photographs and other things that they looked after. And this is me as a 13-year-old in Brighton. Golf range. This is directly after the war. These are the people that looked after us. This is the young boy. This is 1945, 46, winter of. There's snow on the ground. And you'll see I was quite a skinny little boy there. This is the neighbour's son that went to school with my cousins in a school that where Anne Frank
The same school.
was in school as well, opposite. And this is a picture of my mother and me after the war, immediately after the war, in 1945.
And in that Anne Frank, it was also Hannah Goslar, who just has passed away this
Was
week.
a friend, yeah.
She was her best
A
friend.
small community. Yeah, no, I mean, he and my cousin went to a school that was across the road from the school that she went to. It was not quite the same school. This is the uncle that looked after my mother, that took my mother and me in. He's the one that survived the camp, the Japanese prisoner of war camp.
And he helped build over the
He was
River Kwai.
taking me and my aunt's daughter on the holiday to Southend for the day. And I said he lived in Dublin. This is Dublin Airport picture. Various other photos that are not relevant here. But these are photos before the war of me in our garden. This is the aunt that was taken, Sophie, that was taken in 1942, September 1942 to Auschwitz and didn't survive. This is my mother. This is in the apartment that we got after the war, where my aunt and I lived. And this is the neighbour that my aunt's neighbour, who took in all these things and gave us the photos and other things back and returned them to us. She was the mother of the boy you saw in the previous shot. This is more photos of me as a baby. This is the same Aunt Sophie that was the first one to go to Auschwitz in 1942. This is my mother and I going to the wedding of the other cousin, Yanni, that survived Auschwitz, who remarried. She remarried a non-Jewish man who'd from a family where she had been in hiding for a while before she was arrested and taken with her husband. These were taken. This is before the war. This is me before the war. These are me and the little boy that took us in sort of September 45. Up until September 45, from May till September, with the Jewish lady that was married to a non-Jewish man. just a moment. This is picture again of Helen when she died at the age of 10, 11. This is her older brother, Morris, that survived. He went on, he also, from his uncles, learnt to become a ladies' hairdresser. And he then went into the merchant navy. He used to travel to Australia and to New York on the ships doing ladies' hairdressing and so on. But after that he ended up going to South Africa, joining cousins of mine that live in South Africa, or cousins of my mother, who persuaded him to go there. And he got married there and had a daughter in South Africa, in Johannesburg. But that marriage didn't work out too well for him. He came back to England, lived with his wife in England and daughter, and it wasn't the life that she was used to. She was used to this servants. This is under the apartheid time. She wasn't used to sort of the life of living in London, where she had to do and look after herself and her young daughter. So her parents persuaded her to go back to South Africa, and they split up. He remarried, and he ended up living in America, and also in Spain. My uncle, when he retired, bought a flat in Spain and lived in a place called Altea. Because what was happening in Ireland at the time, where IRA bombs were going off, there was a lot of tension, and Brits like him he felt a bit vulnerable.
They were targets. Yeah.
So he retired, and rather than staying in Dublin, as I say, he moved to Spain, to a flat in Altea, which he bought jointly with my cousin. So my cousin spent 6 months of the year with him in Spain and 6 months of the year in America. He didn't want to be settled anywhere. He wasn't, he felt it could all happen again. And so he was, quite a restless sort of person.
2 minutes, I just want to thank you. So I'll just be 1 minute. I just want to thank you so much. I am so grateful to you. There are no words to express my appreciation. It's been such an honor and a privilege, and I am extremely grateful, and it's just unbelievable. It's just incredible what you went through and how you're so positive, and it's amazing. Can I ask, did your mother ever discuss with you?
By the way, these are photograph albums of my aunts that died in Sobibor. Auschwitz. They're holiday photos that they used to when they were travelling in Europe, that were all returned.
And these are the only memories one has?
This is the only connection I have to my aunts, the places they visited, people they went with.
If I can ask, what message do you give, or can you impart for the future generations?
What message? Why am I here in Israel? We're a people, and we have to be we have to know our history. We have to know that all the persecutions that have happened throughout the ages, whether it was in Christian lands or Muslim lands. And we have to be strong in this land called Israel. Whether we're religious or not, we are Jews, we are a people. And we have to be strong and carry on being a light unto the nations and being number one in in bringing good to people wherever they are, whether it's through our technology, through our medicine, through our education, through the fact that we've been a literate nation for 2,000 years. Education comes number one.